Welcome to the Museum Lecture Series. To begin tonight, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that our museums stand on and we live and work on the unceded lands of the Bunurong and the Woiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I'd like to also acknowledge that we are guests on country and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Also, a special hello and welcome to any elders who are with us tonight. I can't see any of you, so I'm not sure who's with us tonight, but welcome to everyone. My name is Beck Harland. I'm a senior curator in the Society and Technology team, and along with my colleagues Kimberly Moulton and Kate Phillips, I chair the lectures committee. And so it seems with only 2 lectures tonight and the next one left in this series, it looks as though we will finish as we began, in isolation. As Melbourne stays at home under stage 4 lockdown and our museums remain closed, we are so grateful to be able to reach out to you this way. Now, for those of you who have not joined us previously, Why Models Work is a lecture series that zooms in on the fascinating models in our newest exhibition, Mini Mega Model Museum at Melbourne Museum. Over the past 4 months, we have discovered intricate hand-woven Gunditjmara baskets that were no bigger than the size of my nail. We looked at a strange model of Captain Cook's cottage made of icing sugar. We've seen sea creatures of glass, realistic gold nuggets, 19th century models of mining, and we even met the wrong dinosaur. Tonight, we bring you the History Edition. We're presenting models from the Society and Technology collection, including the massive handmade doll's house, Pendle Hall, and the 19th century Coliseum fashioned from Cork. And also you'll get to hear about a poignant collection of trench art from World War I. Now, unlike other editions in this series, which have come to you live from our staff's home like this, this edition was actually filmed at Melbourne Museum on the 18th of March, only 2 days after the state of emergency had come into effect and our museum was closed. We recorded to an empty theatre at the time, and now tonight I can bring you that recording. But this is still a live session and interactive. And I have great pleasure in inviting to the screen now Deb Tout-Smith, Michael Reason, Matilda Vaughan, and Sarah Babista. Have we got all of you there? Hi. So whilst this is a recording, it is interactive, as I said, and these wonderful, creative, talented experts are going to stick around for question time at the end. So for those of you who aren't aware of how this works, if you hover your cursor over the screen, at the bottom you'll see a Q&A button. Please do use that during the talks. If you have any questions for our experts, note them there. I will facilitate a Q&A at the end of the recorded part of this segment. And yeah, look, I would say bear with us though. We have 400 households registered tonight. It's our biggest lecture thus far. And so we may not get to all of your questions. The host at the original recording of this lecture was the head of Society and Technology Department, Michelle Stevens. Now, you will see her pop in and out of the recording as she introduces each of our wonderful speakers, but I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker tonight, Matilda Vaughan. So I'll say goodbye to everybody and I'll see you all afterwards. If you could turn your cameras off and your microphones. Our first speaker tonight is Matilda Vaughan, and those of you who have been to each of our lectures will have come to know and love Matilda's work. Matilda has worked with the Society and Technology Collection since 2010. As an engineering curator, she's been researching, documenting, operating and collecting objects that have a connection to our place in the world and the things that have shaped it. She's worked on the restoration of the Great Melbourne Telescope and most recently the restoration of the working models case for the Mini Mega Model Museum exhibition. Tonight, Matilda on the video gives us a brief introduction to the concepts behind the exhibition and the object selection.
I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Bunwurrung and the Woiwurrung peoples whose cultures have been here much longer than any museum, model or real. When we first started thinking about and looking at the models and miniature things in our collections, a question that was always on my mind was, why did this model get made? Sometimes the answer was obvious and sometimes it wasn't. But what connects all the models, regardless of the different motivations for making them, or the materials used to make them, or how they were made, or where they were made, what connects them is their relationship to scale, their physical or even time scale. And that's something that we wanted to emphasise in how the exhibition would physically look. There's an area where you may feel too big, and where all the objects are smaller or miniaturised compared to real life. And where you are asked, why would someone make these things so small? And then there's another area where things are the same sized but not quite what you may be expecting to see in that area, and where we're asking, how do they make the models look so deliciously real? And here we're thinking about how nature identical features and finishes are made in models. And then another area where you are just too small and where the tiny things have been made much bigger. And this is where we think about how making something bigger can perhaps change the way you see the world around you. And is there an inherent beauty in some of the things that are not usually visible to us? The objects all offer some insight into the various reasons why we as humans choose to remake the world around us at different scales. The models invite you to look closer, to look at their details, and perhaps even provoke thoughts about the way your familiarity with or unintentional bias affects how you observe or what you think about a particular object. So the objects we are focusing on for this session each have stories that our speakers will delve into more deeply. Senior Curator Deborah Tout-Smith is looking at trench art. Private Stedwell's model rendition of a German bomber airplane, made while he was waiting to go home and after the end of World War I, is part of the group that we called For Passing Free or Not So Free Time, and where he's used materials scrounged from the battlefield to make a miniature memento and what we now refer to as trench art. Then curator Michael Reason is going to be looking at Pendle Hall's Doll's House, which is part of the group that we called Just for Making Someone Happy, and that's great. The making of it certainly made the maker happy, and it was a continual part of her life over many decades. And finally, conservator Sarah Babister has looked very, very closely at the oldest model in the exhibition, a Coliseum made of cork. The real Coliseum has changed and been restored since 1775 when this model was made, but the way the Coliseum looked back then has been preserved in this model for the future, thanks to all the conservation work that Sarah has done. And this, along with its unusual modelling material, made it just perfect for the group that we called For Deep Freezing Memories. So I'd like to invite Michelle back to the lectern to introduce our first speaker.
Our first speaker, Deborah Tout-Smith, is Senior Curator of Homeland Community in the Society and Technology Department at Museums Victoria. As Matilda said, she's here to speak to us about trench art models. In addition to her knowledge of all things military history, Deb is a lover of the 19th century and knows incredible things about the museum's amazing collection of weird and wonderful recipe books.
Thank you very much. I'm going to address the question of why models work by arguing that they fulfil a need for their makers as well as their audience. This is never more obvious than in the case of trench art. My comments are going to start with a little trench art model aeroplane in the models exhibition, as Matilda said, and move outwards from scale objects to the whole genre of trench art in our collection and in homes across the world. My focus is World War I, but not entirely. This model aeroplane was probably made by Private John Steadwell in France while he was waiting to return to Australia after the war ended. You can see his extraordinary detail, including the tiny bombs on the undercarriage, the gun on the forward cockpit, and the landing gear. He mostly used aluminium sheet with disarmed bullets for propellers and other probably found materials. Private Steadwell was a butcher by trade. He was in his mid-20s when he enlisted in 1915, and he had a pretty good war by World War I standards because he was serving with the 5th Division headquarters, so he was well behind the lines. He was in Egypt and then he was on the Western Front, and he was not wounded even though the 5th Division took part in major battles, including the Battle of Fromelles, the Somme, Polygon Wood, and Villers-Bretonneux. After the armistice, the 5th Division headquarters moved up to the Belgian border and then crossed into Belgium in early March 1919. Private Steadwell might have got work on his crafty activities right after the armistice, when it was relatively safe to walk up to the battlefields and collect materials, except, of course, for the unexploded ordnance in the trenches. Trench art was a creative way of using found materials to make mementos of war experience. The incorporation of battlefield detritus makes the art doubly significant. Work at the 5th Division headquarters where he was based probably began to slacken off as the logistics of repatriating large numbers of soldiers were put in place. Gradually, there was less and less to do. By January, lectures and sports filled the long days until repatriation, as the unit diaries demonstrate. Private Steadwell may have been a bit unwise in his choice of leisure activities beyond his trench art activities, as he fell ill in March with what might be euphemistically called a skin condition. He was sent to England and spent about 2 months in a dermatological hospital before being sent home by ship. Whenever he made the plane, he did like many others. He chose to make a model of technology that was cutting edge at the time, illustrating the machinery of modern warfare. The model was donated to the museum by the Returned and Services League in 1986, and in turn, I believe his wife was probably the donor of the model to the RSL. In the process of working out what we'd put in the models exhibition, Matilda, in seeing this, did some research on it and has identified it as likely to be a model of a German Gotha bomber, a scale about 1 to 50. And here's a wonderful picture of a Gotha bomber from the Australian War Memorial Collection. These aeroplanes entered service later in the war in August 1917 and were used right through to the end of the war. The Gothas had a biplane wing structure, which was then common in aviation, and they were used along the Western Front where Private Steadwell was serving, so he might have seen them airborne, near, sort of beyond the lines. And the Gotha also took part in bombing raids in London in 1917, which is known as London's first Blitz. And 3 of them crashed and could be viewed at close quarters. So we know that the Allies knew the detail of the Gotha bomber, so not just that they'd seen them at a distance. In 1918, during the German Spring Offensive, which started in March, the raids, the Gothas flew many bombing raids in Paris, which caused pretty awful loss of life. So Private Steadwell's bomber reflects many of the characteristics of trench art. Trench art is commonly made during or after active service, and war, of course, is often described as a combination of boredom and terror. Trench art was made while on leave, often not far from the front, sometimes even in the trenches, or while waiting to be repatriated home. Some was made by prisoners of war, such as this tiny submarine flotilla by Corporal William Young of the 22nd Battalion, who had the misfortune to be captured in France in 1918 by the Germans, and he was remained in captivity to the end of the war. Here, Corporal Young uses bullet cartridges and scrap ammunition to get the details right, including the conning tower with a radar, which is the little pieces of wire there, and the large fin underneath, which represents the underwater body of the submarine, with a propeller cutaway at the end of each of these models. The work of both Corporal Young and Private Steadwell reflects another characteristic of trench art. It's usually made from something else, typically material in the battlefields or in the course of service. It generally includes metals or wood, which are durable materials, and sometimes, as you'll see, rocks or stones. It usually, but not always, preserves something of the original form or function of the component parts, such as Private Steadwell's model using a couple of bullets as propellers, even though he might have used another material just as effectively. Trench art's often also quite small, so the pieces at least could be stuffed into pockets or kit bags. It's made for many reasons. Boredom, of course, is the most obvious reason, but it's helpful to unpick the experience of being on active service, facing terrors, everything seeming alien and missing home. Trench art often has a sentimental purpose, crafted to illustrate affection. It's often made as a gift, connecting those at home in a material way with life overseas. It can communicate or commemorate the physicality of battle. It can mark personal significance or meaning, such as a special place or event. And it can even provide a way of marking oneself in the event of a catastrophic wound. It can be a trophy of conquest, taken from a conquered location, or even, as we've seen in some cases, conquered bodies. Trench art is made in as many ways as the crafty imagination can muster. It can be carved, scratched, hammered, punched, or bent. Handy things like soldering irons and welders enabled more complex creations, although in World War I they were really only found well behind the lines and could only be accessed during leave or after war. Anyway, anyone could pretty much give trench art a go without any special skills, which is evident in the quality and form of many of the finished products, and their rustic and sometimes naive form is really part of their appeal. Trench art, of course, is a long history, probably as long as war itself, as I've said, born as much from boredom as pragmatism. One of our earliest examples is actually from the Crimean War. And I'll just do a little bit of a close-up on the actual little item in the box. And the accompanying note reads, "Gathered from the field of Inkerman after battle in 1854. It's got two tiny charms attached, as well as an interesting stone, which was till recently, till I looked at it, described as wood. But one of the charms is actually a little miniature seal of a thistle, which is incredibly endearing. It's very, very tiny. Trench art, of course, is still part of military service today, and the Australian War Memorial does still collect and collects current examples. Now I want you to meet someone, Private John Barney Hines, known as the Souvenir King. There's Barney. He was depicted with his trophies, or souvenirs, as he was called, during on the morning of an advance at Polygon Wood during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, and it was actually one of the battles that was depicted in the Glencorse Wood Interactive in the Love and Sorrow exhibition. This photo was published widely in Australia during and after the war, when the Australian War Museum, as it was then, observed old soldiers felt it represented the larrikin side of the archetypal digger. Note actually a couple of details in the picture, such as the German stick hand grenade at the front left and unspent machine gun bullets there. Probably a fairly hazardous pile. Piles such as Barney's came from battlefields such as this. This is a captured German trench in October 1916, and you get a sense of the extraordinary range of material, the mad disorganisation and frenzy of battle, amidst which people somehow gathered materials and started doing the very human act of creating, shaping, controlling and homemaking. A wide range of things are made in the interest of trench art. Models, as we've seen briefly, were typical outputs of the world wars, miniature copies of weapons, vehicles, ships, aeroplanes, submarines, somehow rendered safe and manageable, mere items of curiosity by their tiny size. Trench art can also produce nifty decorative things for the home, such as pot plants and umbrella holders. And here we see a couple of smoking aids, which used to be a popular choice. The top one is a matchbox cover by Corporal Strawn, who was commemorating the fighting in Ypres. And a generation later, the item below the matchbox holder and ashtray made during World War II was still surprisingly familiar in form. Making these sorts of things while serving overseas is a poignant sort of distant homemaking, dreaming of a future in which the war is commemorated, but safely in the past. A very special prize for strangeness goes to the work of another of the works by Corporal William Young, who did our little flotilla. I'll just show, there it is. He might have done it while he was trapped in that German prison or after the war waiting to go home. So this, you might not be able to tell straight away, is an inkstand made from an 80mm shell fuse, which incorporates bullets and the driving band from a shell. Its plaque is scratched quite crudely with the words 1916-17 Somme. And I'll just show you a little bit of detail, which I thank my colleague Nick Crotty for photographing this for me at short notice. Here you can see the shell fuse, which is like a nose cone with units marked around its base. There's one down there, which may be timing or distance marks. I'm not sure yet. It's quite complex technology and certainly allows much more control of the weapon. And it's a very nasty piece of work, but it has been rendered benign and domestic and strange in the form of an inkwell. Sometimes during war, trench art has a practical purpose. At the front, it might mean better personal identification. And it's extraordinary to think that even during the Second World War, sometimes ID tags, the dog tags, were actually made out of cardboard. And so soldiers or people serving sometimes made up their own identity bracelets or other forms of identification. And the bracelet on the left is inscribed with the service details of Private Victor Sedgwick, who enlisted in the First World War when only a teenager, and he served in the Hazardous Cyclists Corps. Fortunately, he made it safely home. In the Second World War, Captain Francis Laurie probably had a similar idea with his florin coin mounted in a watch strap, which gave a good surface on which to record his details, and you might be able to see there his personal details there. He served in Tobruk and New Guinea, but fortunately also survived the war. Decorative jewelry is another popular form of trench art, with rings and brooches and bracelets quite easy to make and to post home to loved ones. And here's an example of 3. It's a little bit hard to get the scale, but I've made them approximately equivalent. This example of trench art shows how trench art is used to commemorate the physicality of battle, marking an event of personal significance. The little bar brooch on the top features a Turkish shrapnel ball which was removed from the Gallipoli wound of Private George Foster. The note accompanying the brooch said the wound felt as big as your fist, and that's something which we don't often get a record of, is how it felt to be wounded. George had the misfortune to be part of the early landings on Gallipoli and received a wound in his loin on the 28th of April, so just a couple of days after he landed. The wound was sufficiently severe for him to be sent to England by hospital ship, but he later returned to fight. He was in Egypt and then the Western Front. George died on the Western Front in January 1917. His personal items were sent home to his wife, although the list of those doesn't include the brooch, which was probably sent to her earlier. So these types of items can carry quite deep and poignant stories. But we don't always know the stories, and the ring marked Isa 1417, the one at the bottom, is by an unknown maker. The Isa front, also known as the West Flemish front, ran along the Isa River in northwest Belgium, and the area endured particularly vicious battles in 1914 and 1917, and definitely moments of importance or periods of importance in people's lives. Even more basic is the simple brass ring made from a shell case by someone we'll probably never identify. The meaning it served, the time it represented, has ended. I'd like to finish with trench art that's not strictly speaking trench art, but is often considered to be trench art. I've suggested that trench art is usually associated with service. After World War I, a vast quantity of war materials were gathered to bring back to Australia as mementos by individuals and by organisation. And here is a photograph of the Australian War Records Section's trophy store in Millwall Docks in London around June 1919, showing a collection of captured German trench mortars or Minenwerfers and hundreds of MG machine guns and accessories. Much of it, or pretty much all of it, was destined for the new Australian War Museum to become the Australian War Memorial. There was so really far too much of it for the new War Museum to cope with, and at the same time they soon became desperately short of cash. So in the early 1920s, museum staff were set to work converting these items into handy things for the home. Here are some. They set up a sales section, and in 1 week alone in 1923, 200 pounds of goods were sold. Here are some of their German cartridge cases transformed into attractive utilities, umbrella stands and pot plant holders. The Melbourne Journal Table Talk even suggested they would make fine Christmas gifts in 1927. I'll just pause on that for a second so you can enjoy the coal bucket, hanging basket and pot stand, all made out of German tin hats. And this example here, a German machine gun belt boxes ready to ensure the safety of your documents, as it says there, without a hint of irony. And German rifle cartridges made into cutlery which assuredly lend, and I quote, to these small articles that sentimental value so often lacking in ordinary presents. Sometimes trench art was sold for other good causes, such as a pair of German shell cases we have in our collection, which were supposedly sold for invalids and orphans in France after the war. But unfortunately, there were a lot of charlatans and money makers and private profiteers in Europe after the war, making money in causes that weren't necessarily legitimate. I hope ours were legitimate. Even today, trench art fakes are seen in the market, such as a Gallipoli water bottle I saw a couple of years ago, and I think it probably was a water bottle with a provenance such as Gallipoli, certainly the First World War, but it had been recently painted with a folksy landscape with the idea that would raise money because it had this personal depiction added. So my journey into trench art has moved from models into other creations. I want to end by returning to the question of why trench art works. Trench art can fulfil a need for the maker, such as relieving boredom, engaging in a memory practice, or filling a practical need. It can provide a safe way of working through disturbing memories of place and of experience. In miniature form, it can give quite realistic depictions of technology and physical place and experience. As a souvenir, it can support connections between those serving and those back home. Once home after the war, it can make a statement about having done one's bit in the war and being patriotic. Above all, it can nourish memory and well-being in the long post-war years. Thank you.
Thank you for that fascinating insight into the many and varied reasons that people make and keep trench art, Deb. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Michael Reason. Michael is our Curator of Leisure and Social Spaces. He is the keeper of all things Farlap, an amazing connoisseur of Melbourne and Australian fashion, and an incredible wealth of knowledge about popular culture. But tonight he's here to talk to us about Pendle Hall and one woman's quest to make a fantastic doll's house.
Hello everyone, I'm here to talk about Pendle Hall Doll's House. And I started off by calling it a doll's house, but never a doll house. Because when people hear that I look after a doll's house, they sort of roll their eyes and they imagine it's going to be something like a cheap tacky Barbie dream house or something. But then I tell them, you come in and see Pendle Hall and see what a magical, wonderful thing it is. Now, in 2010, Museums Victoria decided to do what a lot of people have been trying to do in this post-GFC times, is to acquire a house. Now, we were able to do it quite easily, but of course there was a bit of a difference to this house. This house is actually a doll's house, and it was in Tasmania. It was built over a 40-year period by a woman called Felicity Clemens, who was born Felicity Symes, and she came from the Symes family, her father was the editor of the Age newspaper. So strong links to Melbourne. Now, so we were offered this wonderful doll's house. The first thing I say to people is that they look at it and go, oh, that's nice, but then it's a bit hard to see the scale, but that house is actually taller than I am. So it's a 6-foot, 21-room, 4-story doll's house, and is just an amazing piece of craft and workmanship. Now, Felicity, she was born in Melbourne, as I said, to the Symes family, but she found love in Tasmania by a very suave doctor called Mr. Max Clemens. She fell in love and she decided to leave her life in Melbourne and to move down to Tasmania. She started a family, and her daughter Antonia was given a doll's house, or a little one-story doll's house, which she looked at and said, I don't think much of this. I'm sure I could do something better. I think she was actually thinking it was going to be a little short-term project, but it ended up being decades that she spent on it. Obviously not full-time, but she spent a lot of time on this thing. Now, she was a perfectionist. Pre-Google, of course, she couldn't just go online and say, what does a Georgian doll's house look like? But no, she bought books. She subscribed to magazines, including the famous Country Life, and she went through them, and she was very meticulous. She wanted to look for exactly each piece of furniture, and she thought about it. And the other thing she did was she gave the house a layered history. Now, it's very easy to make a doll's house of the 1760s as a sort of snapshot of what was new and what was in at that time, but she decided to actually give it this layered history, have older furniture, have parts of an older house that obviously had been demolished for this new house, and then she also decided to actually bring it forward to the 1860s. So here was a 1760s house, but as it was in 1860s. So there were some things updated to give it that sort of new look. So here it is in all its grandeur. And of course, she was very much of the time upstairs and downstairs. So she's built this wonderful house with lots of different rooms. Here it is all closed up. And she's even sort of given it this wonderful sort of staircase thing at the thing, which you don't actually see when it's opened up. But no, she decided, like any good perfectionist, if you look at the back of something and it's as good as the front, you know that they really know what they're doing. Now, it's got a number of rooms. I won't go through them all, but I thought I'd show some of them. Here is the drawing room. And of course, being a good doll's house, she decided to populate it. It's often been compared to Queen Mary's doll's house in Britain, which is actually built for Queen Mary. It was built by a lot of people, though. And the other thing, of course, it doesn't actually have a family in it. But no, Felicity, she decided to give her house history, and she filled it with the Halifax family, their extended family, and the servants as well. So she had great fun making all these characters for the house, and we've had great fun sort of setting them up and sort of giving them a backstory as well. So as I said, downstairs as well, here's the kitchen, and this is a good close-up giving you some of the ideas of some of the wonderful things that the house is filled with. That's the laundry, and I do like the stockings and the various sheets and other things hanging up upstairs, up the top there. And here's the larder, of course, which is another wonderful room. And we can see there, it also is looking at 1860s, this is. So, as I said, even being an older house, it's actually been updated to as the house was in the 1860s. So with some slightly more modern things there, like a lovely place for your meats and all that. I do like the bedrooms particularly. Here's the blue bedroom. And it's actually been set up during the day, so of course the staff are hard at work. And here's the Chinese bedroom, which I believe the bed is based on one in the V&A, although she didn't like the colour scheme and she changed it to sort of suit her taste. I just thought I'd give you just an idea. The house can go from dawn to dusk, so you have daytime and nighttime, and it just looks amazing any time of the day. Now, you're probably wondering, Felicity Clemens. Now, is this Felicity Clemens? What sort of woman that would build a doll's house like that? No, this is actually not Felicity Clemens. This is an anonymous woman from our collection. This is actually Felicity Clemens. She was stylish, she was urbane, and she was probably what we'd call a bright young thing from the 1920s and 30s. I like this next one. This is a drawing which was done of her before she was married, but she was very artistic. She won many awards at the various arts and crafts exhibitions around town, and you can see she was a very glamorous, stylish woman. Actually, I did some research on her, and her name kept popping up in Table Talk and The Home, which were both like high society, but cutting-edge high society. You know, the glamorous people were in these magazines. And I did find one where she was having a party at her parents' house in Kew, and the description was, Felicity looked stunning in a shimmering satin tissue frock woven with metal threads which gleamed gold and silver in the lamplight, while a floral design in pale Venetian terracotta was mingled with ivory and grey. Don't you just want to have that frock? But no, as I said, no, this is unfortunately I couldn't find her wedding, but this was her sister's wedding a few years before, and you can tell they were old money, but they were also very stylish old money, so they were a good combination there. That's actually Felicity in the top right corner, and this just shows the sort of the British pride that people had at that time. So this is pre her marrying, and this is all her sisters as well. So they did come from a very proud British moneyed family. Just as an aside, a couple of things I came across was this one thing about the new wave was dioramas. You know, you didn't have a picture hanging on your wall, you had a picture box with a diorama in it. So maybe this is where the Felicity got the idea of the doll's house from, to sort of make something artistic in miniature. And this is completely as an aside, but I just came across Melbourne's first female football match, where it asked the questions, can women play football? And of course we know the answer to that now. Sorry, that was just as an aside. Now this is Pendle Hall as it was down in Tasmania. So she built it over a 40-year period. She had a very great interest in the past, and although she could have gone into chrome furniture and all the modern stuff of the 20s and 30s, she was actually very interested in the brown furniture, the oaks, the mahoganies, and so she actually built up a collection and opened her own museum in Westbury, which is just out of Launceston. It's known as a very British town, and it's got the, I think, Australia's only village green in it. So anyway, this was on display as it was since 1971 in the White House. Slightly different as it was displayed these days, and it also explains why the house was quite dirty when it arrived. But yeah, our conservators did wonderful things with it, and it now gleams, so that's good. And there it is. That's with the "Please do not touch" and "Please do not take photo" signs. But and still very impressive it was. I actually grew up in Tasmania and actually went and saw the house, dragged my family in to see this wonderful mad museum, and certainly do remember seeing the house. So little did I know that I would actually become far more sort of knowledgeable about it in years to come. Now, of course, how do you move a house like that? With very care and consideration. We're fortunate that we had someone who had previously worked here, a conservator called Michelle Berry, who was had a consulting business down in Tasmania. We were able to employ her, and she packed it up. She photographed every room, she numbered it, and then she packed it up, ready to move to Melbourne, and sort of to say how skillful she was. Nothing was broken, nothing was lost. It all arrived perfectly. One of the great things that it does have is that Felicity was very much about educating people. So when the house was on display, it had this wonderful board that she made up showing how it was built, and all the miniature tools she used, including she did steal some of her husband's scalpels, which was very good for cutting the wood for the parquetry floor. She used very authentic woods, mahoganies, oaks, cherry wood, that sort of thing. And she loved educating people about the amount of work that was put into making this wonderful house. We do still have this board, which was donated with the house, so when it's on display, you can actually have this alongside it. I just thought it was interesting to see some of the details which you might not notice at first thing. This is one of the ceilings, and again, just the amount of work she put into things that you might not be able to see unless you're kneeling down on the floor looking up. It's got a lovely painted ceiling in one of the rooms. I think I mentioned before about the layered history. This is she decided to put this sort of earlier oak panelling, Jacobean oak panelling, which she suggested had come out of a previously demolished Jacobean house. This gives you a good idea about the parquetry floor, which she made by hand. She cut out every piece. one part of the staircase just wouldn't sit properly, so she ripped it all out and she started again because she was a true perfectionist. And there's a close-up of the parquetry floor, but yeah. See, it'd be easy today to sort of make it, print it out and all that sort of thing, but no, every piece is made by hand and sits beautifully. I'll give you a hint there. This is the top of the house. The house is actually wired up to be lit. Of course, we wouldn't be using that wiring these days, but we've left it in situ so you can still sort of appreciate the amount of work she put into it. I just highlight some other parts of the house. I do like this. It's a doll's house within a doll's house. This is the nursery for the children. And like all good children, they were put away right into the cellar, so the parents didn't have to see them at all. So they're there with their nanny. Now, Pendle Hall came to us in 2010, and we were hoping at some stage to put on display. Fortunately, a doll's house needs a very big case, which does come at a cost. So it was sort of sitting there waiting for its time to come. Fortunately, then the Mega Mini Model Museum came along, curated by the wonderful Matilda Vaughan, and of course one of the things she thought, I must find some way of getting Pendle Hall into the display, and she sort of imagined it, and her and her team imagined it in a way I certainly never would have, and she sort of asked and answered the question, could I get into the doll's house? Could I actually experience what it's like to be in a doll's house? And she sort of found a way to do that. So now you can actually come and see Pendle Hall in all its glory, and this is how it looks these days. Slightly different than it was when it was down in Westbury, but I think we've done a bit of magic on it. So I do invite you all to come and see Pendle Hall when things get better, and I think we'll all be feeling like something to cheer us up, and I think nothing will cheer you up more, whether you're 9, 90 or 900, than seeing this amazing house and seeing the amount of love and attention that Felicity put into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for that glimpse into the amazing detail of Pendle Hall. Every time I see it, I learn something new, and I have to say that dress you described, I want it. I'd now like to invite our final speaker to the stage. Sarah Babista is an objects conservator at Museums Victoria, and tonight she'll be talking to us about the restoration of the Coliseum model. Sarah is passionate about the role conservation can play in exhibition development and has a long-term interest in implementing innovative preservation strategies for collections on display. Welcome, Sarah.
It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about the museum's Coliseum model, of which I'm very passionate about. My work on this amazing object began in 2010, so quite some time ago, when I saw it in the collection store and, driven by curiosity about it being made from Cork, did a quick search in the museum's database. Coincidentally, my colleague at the time, Richard Gillespie, also happened to be investigating the model with the idea of deaccessioning it, in part due to its poor condition. But little did we know that our mutual curiosity would take us on a 10-year journey of research and discovery about the model and its maker, Richard Deberg, and more broadly the history of Cork modelling, and eventually confirm the Coliseum as the only known survivor of more than 40 models that Deberg made and displayed in his popular London exhibitions between 1775 and 1819. So in today's talk, I want to share some of this research, as well as provide some insights into the materials and techniques that Deberg used to make the model, followed by a discussion of the conservation treatment, which has allowed the Coliseum to be returned to display after nearly 100 years. So the technique of cork modelling appears to have emerged in Rome in the 1760s, and it's commonly thought to have originated with Italian modellers Cicci, Rosa and Altieri, who were most likely exposed to the technique in Naples, where it had been used to create nativity scenes for centuries. Within a few years, the production of cork models had become a flourishing craft, developed in response to travellers who pilgrimed to Europe, particularly Italy, as part of the Grand Tour. Amongst this increasing number of visitors, there was a great desire to record experiences of their travels, which led to craft-based methods of recording being adopted. Many visitors, fascinated by the ruins of ancient Rome, aimed to take home a souvenir, much like we do today when visiting a new place. And for those who could afford them, cork models provided a three-dimensional alternative to the etchings of Rome being made at the time. So how does our model fit into this picture? It was made in 1775 by Richard Deberg, a London-born artist. Accounts reveal that he travelled to France and Italy in 1760, aged 22, and he spent the next 9 years abroad, absorbing classical aesthetics and techniques. Unfortunately, there's no written evidence of Deberg's time in Italy. However, it's most likely he was exposed to the technique of cork modelling during this period. By 1771, Deberg reappears in London, where he exhibits his first cork model. And in 1775, he displays a model of the Coliseum, which our research suggests is most likely our model. Advertisements reveal that in 1785, Deberg was exhibiting around 39 cork models of classical sites from Italy, France, and Britain, offering an alternative grand tour, which had by then become a staple of London cultural life. Unfortunately, a fire in the same year, said to have been caused by his famous activated model of Vesuvius, destroyed a large portion of the display, and it's not until 1799 that Deberg reappears with a new exhibition of cork models, which would remain open for a further 20 years. By 1819, thinning audiences saw the exhibition close, and his models are auctioned to raise money for his retirement. The Coliseum next appears in the collection of Thomas Leyland, a successful merchant, who donates it to the South Kensington Museum, which is now the V&A, in 1859. And in 1909, he passes it to the Science Museum in London, and in 1929, it's donated to the Industrial and Technological Museum, which is now Museums Victoria, where it remained in storage until its transfer to the Conservation Lab in 2010. Sadly, no other models clearly provenance to Deberg have survived, but several are preserved in photographs, including his model of the amphitheatre at Verona, which is seen here in the Bodleian Library in 1910. So returning to our model, examination has shown it is made almost entirely from cork, with the exception of the decorative column capitals, which are moulded from plaster. The plinth supporting the model is made from 10 pieces of hardwood secured together with nails to form a solid structure. Analysis identifying the coatings applied across the wooden plinth and the cork have shown them to be gesso made of calcium sulfate, which was a material commonly found in the Mediterranean basin. But before proceeding further, I want to take a moment to actually just discuss cork and its unique properties, as it's these properties which made it a popular choice for architectural models, whilst also contributing in part to the longevity of the Colosseum. Cork is derived from the cork oak tree, which is native to southwest Europe and northwest Africa. An average tree lives for 170 to 200 years, and it's characterised by a continuous outer layer of cork, which you can see in the image on the left. It's removed in sheets every 9 to 12 years without causing harm to the tree. But what makes cork really special is its chemical inertness, its elasticity, and its resistance to pests and rotting. And conveniently, particularly for conservators, it also does not absorb dirt and is resistant to abrasion. As a modelling material, the softness of cork lends itself to being easily worked in fine detail, while its density and flexibility allows working with a low risk of fracture. Most importantly, the natural appearance of cork replicates the surface of aged brick and stone, making it an ideal material to depict the decay of classical monuments and buildings. But let's now turn our attention to the model's conservation. Work began with detailed assessment to record the Colosseum's condition. And during this stage, initial observations on the materials and techniques were also recorded, and a plan devised to obtain information about its construction and artistic intent. To do this, I utilised a variety of technical tools, but two in particular, UV examination and X-ray imaging, proved pivotal for revealing how the model was made and how it could also be conserved. Early inspection of the cork had revealed the use of metal fasteners to secure the columns. However, the amount used, their length, location, and how they were applied across the model was unknown. So to gain insight, 8 detached pieces from the upper wall were x-rayed, revealing Deberg applied nails deep inside the cork to join pieces before carefully filling and painting over the entry points to provide a finished surface. The x-rays also revealed the use of nails at unstable points such as cracks, which proved incredibly useful when it came to the reassembly. However, probably the most surprising thing was the small quantity of nails that were actually used, suggesting the pieces were joined by adhesive, but also reflecting Deberg's skill at working with cork. The model was also examined under UV light to identify areas of repair and modification which were not visible with the naked eye. And this technique revealed many old repairs and potential weak points, particularly on sections of the upper and lower exterior wall. It also proved invaluable in identifying areas of new loss versus Deberg's original representations of damage, which ageing had made difficult to differentiate. And this is demonstrated in this photograph, where the blue fluorescence of an old adhesive highlights where pieces of cork were originally attached. When the same area is examined in daylight, the adhesive residue is not visible, and these losses could have been misinterpreted as being part of the original design. So how did the model look before treatment? At first glance, it looked to be in pretty bad condition, with over 100 fractured and loose pieces and years of dust rendering it unreadable. Additionally, the wooden plinth exhibited large splits leading to some distortion of the lower colonnade. However, despite this, the model as a whole was surprisingly stable. Instead, it was actually some of the original surface finishes which were in poor condition, particularly the gesso which Deberg had applied to the wooden plinth. And when I examined it, I found that it was actively detaching, even with the most gentle contact. So due to this, the consolidation treatment of the gesso was prioritised. When treating an object, it's crucial to ensure that there's no alteration to the original materials, so careful consideration and testing was given to choosing the most compatible consolidant as well as the application method. In the end, the gesso was successfully consolidated with a cellulose-based solution applied with an ultrasonic mister, which delivered a fine, low-pressure mist, gently penetrating and strengthening the coating without needing to make direct contact. So with the gesso conserved, the model was then cleaned to remove years of dust, and over many weeks, its detail and colours slowly began to emerge. Once cleaned, it was on to the most challenging stage of the treatment, the assembly. After 240 years, I'll confess, I wasn't feeling very optimistic about having all of the pieces, though I won't lie that I was a little bit excited about testing out my cork carving skills. However, to my great surprise, when I did a dry assembly, all of the columns and sections of the upper wall were present, and only one structural element in the lower arena was missing. So as you can imagine, reconstructing an object of this size requires a lot of preparation and planning to avoid locking out pieces and having to reverse repairs. So to prevent this, the pieces were laid out, they were numbered, and a sequence carefully developed and practiced many times. Through this process, it was found that some pieces needed to be pre-joined, while others needed to be partially secured but remain flexible in order to achieve the curved alignment. Consequently, the materials and methods of attachment needed to be carefully considered, and in the end I used a combination of a pH-neutral acrylic adhesive and flexible stainless steel entomology pins to secure the fractured pieces in place. And this approach proved to be a great success, and over 2 very long days, myself and my colleague at the time carefully dowed, aligned, adhered and clamped all the pieces into position. So with the model back together, my attention then turned to the question of whether lost pieces should be replicated, and aesthetic approaches such as retouching applied. Decisions of this kind should always be made within the context of an object's purpose, meaning and values. And in this instance, the Coliseum's purpose of educating the public by highlighting the building's architectural detail and design meant it would be appropriate to replicate and integrate confirmed missing elements. So given this, the lost capitals were replicated and cast using wax moulds and missing structural elements carved from compressed cork. As these materials were not easily distinguishable after retouching, detailed documentation was carried out identifying the location of introduced materials in order to provide a clear record for the future. And as a final step, visually distracting losses in the gesso coating, which was on the plinth, were inpainted in order to integrate the plinth with the model. So here is just a picture of the model before treatment, just to remind everyone the condition that it was in when I first took it out of the store in 2010 and how it looked after the treatment was completed. So my research into Deberg's exhibition and his practice of cork modelling was invaluable for understanding why the Coliseum was made and how it should be conserved. And after 10 years of research and treatment, it's incredibly rewarding to see it return to display to be enjoyed by the public. Thank you.
I'm going to ask each of the speakers to join me again on screen, if you could turn your cameras back on, and we might address some of these questions. There's Deb. Hi, Deb. If you could turn your mic back on.
Hello.
If we could have Michael back, and also Sarah and Matilda. Hi. So we've got quite a few questions here. Right. Now, I wasn't able to see the questions for part of the session, so they've all been adding up here. Look, I think we'll dive into you, Deb. That was a wonderful first session. Thank you. We have some questions about the tools that we used. Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting to think of the tools, for instance, that Private Steadwell would have used to make the Goethe bomber, and of course the other items of trench art that I shared. The challenge is that we don't have great information from the makers themselves, which we'd love to have. So we need to look at the items themselves for clues about where they were made and when they were made. For instance, do we know anything about if they were made in the trenches or back from the front lines, if it was France or PNG or Egypt? But in most cases, we don't know the items in our collection, we don't know about that either. So we need to take educated guesses about tools based on construction and materials. For instance, the strange inkwell made by Corporal William Young, he's clearly used a soldering iron. He's not very good at it. Poor old Corporal Young. He's a bit rough, and I think a couple of his mini flotillas have snapped off over the years, and he's rather roughly resoldered them, but their charm is still there. It's interesting that Goethe bomber, Private Steadwell, I don't think can wield a soldering iron, or maybe he didn't have a soldering iron. He was a butcher by trade. And looking at the images in detail, I can't see any soldering. I think he's used rivets and tin snips, might have used a few screws, but even the little German cross on the wings are actually riveted on to the plain body. So it's a really interesting question, and it's a bit of an unknown for us, unfortunately, but we can do some guessing.
Look, Deb, that leads straight into another question that I think any of our curators tonight could answer, because they're all working on the current collecting project around the pandemic, collecting the curve. Someone's asking, actually Ken McInnes is asking, should we be collecting or looking for lockdown art now? Deb, do you want to?
I'm really happy to jump in first.
Yeah,
and I have to say, absolutely, yes. In fact, Museums Victoria's been gathering some wonderful lockdown art and lockdown stories and lockdown photographs, and it's actually been a really important project for us over the past few months, and you'll be able to see some of that material online. We also have mounted small displays at our museum sites, but unfortunately they were sort of open for the blink of an eye and have closed again. But we look forward to the day we can reopen and share some of the material we're collecting. But we're hastily getting our new acquisitions up on collections online, and are really recognising that this is an incredibly important time for us to be making sense of the world we're living through and sort of collecting the things that make meaning for all of us. And that's really an important part of the museum's work. So yeah.
Yeah, as an example, I collected a handmade brooch from a couple in Queensland, which celebrates the toilet paper. It was happening in March, and it says, "I survived the toilet paper panic of 2020." So, you can collect these things which have a serious side, but a bit of humour as well.
Absolutely. And I also collected a sign that was in the media a few weeks ago, just before the towers in Melbourne went into lockdown, a play on the Checkpoint Charlie sign, Checkpoint Barclay, in the western suburbs, kind of as an expression of the lockdown of the streets and the kind of militarisation of the hotspot suburbs, and it sort of became a portent for what happened over that weekend with the towers locking down and police assisting in that process. So yeah, we are all collecting around that. That was a great question, thank you. Matilda, Maxine Gibson is asking a question that I think is about your favourite object. She says, a long time ago when the museum, the library and the art gallery were all in the same building, there were 2 working models in the science area. About 1980, I took my kids to the Science Museum, but they were in a shed at the back and I was told it would cost too much to restore them. My question is, are they still there?
I'm not sure. I don't know which one you mean, but there were definitely the working models case is in the Mini Mega Model Museum exhibition, and it has been restored last year to be working the same as it did from the late 1920s to the mid 1980s. So, but it was on display in the museum when it was at the State Library. So at the time you're talking about. I don't know which other ones you might mean.
I can just say that Matilda spends every day working on them when we're in the building, maintaining them. Michael, I have a question from Jessica Lehman for you.
Certainly, yes.
What did you mean when by that you could view the dollhouse in dawn or dusk? Also, did the house come totally intact with the figurines and furniture, or were the aspects that we had to recreate when they came to the museum?
Well, the house was originally designed with this very intricate electric system, which Felicity had put in, so the house could light up and it could sort of be shown in different, amounts of light and all that. So you could sort of create morning or evening or that. So that was very good. We haven't actually used the electric system because it's sort of deteriorated over the years. So hopefully one day we'll be able to put that back into place. But the rest of the house is absolutely as it came to us from Tasmania. So that's everything in there is been made by Felicity. We've had to actually do very little to it. The only little problem there was that some of the parquetry, the glue that held it down, had started to lift. So we actually had to re-glue in some places, but that was just from age, because glue doesn't age very well. But otherwise, it was in wonderful condition. So we're very lucky to get it as is, and we've certainly made the most of keeping it that way. The way that Felicity kept it. So yes.
Thank you. Now, Sarah, I believe you can turn your camera on now and your microphone, because I have a couple of questions for you if you'd like to join us.
Hey, Beck, I am here. Unfortunately, my video isn't working, I think, because of the internet dropping out, but I can hear the question, so go ahead.
Terrific. Okay, so Saskia Erickson asks, have Richard Deberg's descendants seen your beautiful restoration?
That's a bit of a mystery. We did do quite a lot of work to identify Deberg and his family early on, so we know where he was born and so forth, but we haven't been able to track any of his children and descendants, so I'm not sure, to be honest. It would be amazing if they did get the chance to see it and to reach out. Hopefully that happens once the object's on display.
Yeah, it might help with the video being online and think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Connections get made. Another question for you, Sarah. How did the Coliseum end up in the deteriorated condition that you found it in when it came to the lab?
That's also a little bit of a mystery. The model was donated and was sent to the museum in 1929. So it would have come over on a ship. And I know when I was cleaning it in the initial stages, I found a lot of straw and things that had been used to pack out the model to obviously keep it safe when it travelled over here. So it's quite possible that damage was sustained in that initial trip when it was sent to Melbourne. It's also possible that something happened whilst it was in the care of the museum. We don't know for sure. When I first started working on the model in 2010, I literally just found a bag of pieces sitting in the middle of the arena, and there wasn't any prior documentation. So that's kind of where I started, and I'm not quite sure how it got as damaged as it was.
Thank you. Stephen Burgess asks something really interesting that I think will take all of you in different ways to answer. Firstly, Stephen says, thank you for the brilliant presentations. The question is, how much of your time would be spent researching the history, storage of items, the history and story of the items versus actually preparing or restoring them? Now, I know personally that each of you do research in your roles, but perhaps, Sarah, we could start with you, because perhaps people don't realise that conservators do as much research as they do.
Yeah, absolutely, Beck. I think for the Coliseum, it was many, many years of research in order to understand why it was made, its purpose, its meaning, because that obviously informs how we treat objects and how we conserve the kind of intangible elements as well as the tangible aspects of a model. But also a lot of my time was just spent understanding the materials and techniques, and that's an absolute foundation of conservation, because you need to know what you're working on in order to choose the best methodology to conserve the object. So I started working on it in 2010. It was a personal project, so it wasn't an exhibition priority at that time, but I spent years with my colleague Richard at the time just researching and understanding Cork modelling as a technique and looking at our model before I actually started treating. And I think the treatment probably took me about 6 months all up.
Wow. Deb, for instance, I know, and this is what people perhaps don't understand, is that we all have many, many different collections that we have responsibility for, but perhaps you could just talk about the trench art.
Yes, indeed, yes. I should start by saying I'm always looking for reasons to do research, and preparing for the presentation on trench art was a great example. It allowed me to understand, to research the makers, to find out what we could know, look at the old supplementary files, the information that comes in about objects, and sort of try to build that picture up. But it's an iterative process, and when we acquire material into the collection, we gather as much information as we can, and then it waits until we're putting it out on collections online or selecting it for display or the subject of a lecture or something. Then we'll do that deeper research, which might mean recontacting families, going deep dives into archives, in that case, National Archives and the Australian War Memorial, and other similar collections. So it's hard to say that you wouldn't say there's a particular level of research that you put into any object or any story, but you dive as deep as circumstances will allow. And I always think it's sort of like a treasure hunt, and it's a great joy to be uncovering, and everything we uncover, then we document so that the next generation of curators and researchers will be able to pick those threads up and push that story further.
So true. Look, there's the last few questions coming through, but before we get to those, I just wanted to ask those joining us tonight, at the bottom of your screen, there's a polling button. I'm going to launch the poll right now. It's just 3 quick questions so that we can get a sense of who's out there, who's with us. As I said, we can't see you. And if you could take a moment just to answer those questions, that would be wonderful. And while you're doing that, I'll read out the last couple of questions. Mainly they're thank yous. People are thanking you all for your time and your wonderful presentations. I suppose a great way to end is that a few people have mentioned that they can't wait to come and see the exhibition, Matilda. It's been sad for everybody at the museum that this wonderful show has had so much time closed because of the pandemic, and the exhibition is closed along with the museum. But I'm getting questions. Does the exhibition have a set closing date, or will it be extended?
I believe it has been extended. It had already been extended to February 2021, but I believe now, because of our pandemic situation, that it will stay beyond that, possibly to the middle of next year.
That's wonderful. So I'd just like to close by saying thank you to all our speakers tonight for sharing your expertise and your time. I know how strange it can be to do this from home when we're so used to doing this in the theatre at Melbourne Museum.